February 1942. A winter dawn settles over an industrial city in Central Europe. Factory chimneys still smoke, but the rhythm has changed. Trains arrive late. Machines idle longer between shifts. Foremen wait for materials that do not come. On paper, the war looks unstoppable. On the ground, the system is straining. Germany's war economy is already cracking. This is not the image history usually presents. The familiar story places collapse at the end after defeat on the battlefield, after cities lie in ruins. But the truth is more unsettling. The pressure points appeared much earlier, hidden beneath production reports and confident proclamations. By 1942, long before the war was lost, Germany's ability to sustain total war was beginning to fail. To understand why, we need to step back, not to the front lines, but into the machinery that fed them. From the very beginning, Germany's war economy was built on speed. Rapid victories were supposed to pay for the next campaign. Conquered territories would supply raw materials, labor, and fuel. Short wars would avoid long shortages. This approach worked briefly. The campaigns of 1939 and 1940 delivered stunning results. Factories expanded, production surged, confidence soared. But this success hid a dangerous assumption that war would remain short, controlled, and profitable. By 1941, that assumption was gone. The conflict expanded across continents. Supply lines stretched thousands of kilometers. Consumption of fuel, steel, and explosives soared, and Germany found itself fighting not one opponent, but a coalition with far greater industrial depth. By early 1942, the economic strain was no longer theoretical. Coal deliveries fell behind schedule. Rail networks were congested beyond capacity. Skilled workers were pulled into the military faster than replacements could be trained. Substitutes replaced essentials. Quality declined as quantity struggled to keep pace. At the same time, strategic bombing began to bite, even before the most devastating air campaigns. Factories faced disruptions, power outages, transport delays, worker displacement. Production targets could still be announced, but meeting them required extraordinary improvisation. The margin for error vanished. This is where the story matters. Because total war is not only about weapons, it is about systems, transport, energy, labor, finance. When one element falters, pressure spreads everywhere. Germany's economy had little flexibility. The state had already squeezed civilian consumption to sustain military output. Imports were restricted by blockade and geography. Synthetic alternatives replaced natural resources at high cost and lower efficiency. Every solution created new dependencies. By 1942, even financial signals pointed to trouble. The regime masked deficits through controls and accounting measures. Prices were fixed, wages constrained. Official stability was maintained by force and regulation. But beneath the surface, the cost of war was accelerating faster than the economy could absorb. Production increases came from longer hours, not better supply. From forced substitutions, not abundance. From pressure, not resilience. And pressure accumulates. The turning point was not a single decision. It was the recognition, quiet, internal, and urgent, that the war could no longer be sustained on the original terms. Germany now faced a dilemma it had tried to avoid. It could continue expanding the war economy without the resources to support it, or it could restructure the system entirely, centralizing control, reallocating labor, and pushing society even harder toward total mobilization. Either choice carried risk. What made 1942 decisive was not defeat, but exposure. The illusion of limitless momentum was gone. The economy had reached its limits sooner than expected, and the gap between ambition and capacity was widening. This is why the cracks matter. They explain why later decisions were so extreme, why control tightened, why labor policies hardened, why production targets became more desperate. These were not signs of strength. They were symptoms of strain. Germany was still dangerous, still capable, still producing weapons at scale. But it was doing so on an unstable foundation. The war economy was no longer growing naturally, it was being forced. And once an economy reaches that stage, collapse becomes a question of timing, not possibility. By 1942, the outcome was not decided, but the trajectory was. The system that had powered early victories was already consuming itself, and from that point forward, every gain required greater sacrifice, deeper control, and more fragile solutions. The collapse would come later, but the failure had already begun. By mid-1942, Germany's war economy entered a new phase, not of expansion, but of escalation. The leadership understood that the existing system could no longer sustain the war as it was being fought. Resources were insufficient, transport was overstretched, labor shortages were becoming chronic. Yet the military demands only grew larger. More weapons, more fuel, more output, everywhere, all at once. The response was not restraint, it was pressure. Economic control tightened across every sector. Production targets were raised even as inputs declined. Central authorities intervened directly in factory schedules, labor allocation, and raw material distribution. Decisions once handled by industrial managers were now dictated from above. This shift created the appearance of momentum. Official figures showed rising output in certain categories. Reports highlighted increases in weapons production. But these numbers concealed a dangerous truth. Gains were coming from exhaustion, not efficiency. Factories extended working hours. Maintenance was deferred. Machinery wore down faster than it could be repaired. Skilled workers were replaced with hastily trained laborers. The system produced more at steadily rising cost and declining durability. Transportation became a critical bottleneck. Rail networks carried troops, weapons, coal, food, and industrial components simultaneously. There was no redundancy. Delays cascaded. A shortage of locomotives in one region disrupted production hundreds of kilometers away. Fuel scarcity forced prioritization, leaving entire sectors operating intermittently. The economy had become brittle. At the same time, Germany's reliance on substitute materials deepened. Synthetic fuel, artificial rubber, and ersatz components filled gaps left by natural shortages. These substitutes required more energy, more labor, and more infrastructure than the resources they replaced. This was not sustainable growth. It was conversion under constraint. Strategic bombing intensified the problem. Even when factories were not destroyed, disruption was constant. Power failures halted production. Transport links were severed. Workers were displaced. Output targets were missed not because of lack of will, but because systems could not recover fast enough. The response was dispersion. Factories were broken into smaller units. Production was scattered across regions. Underground facilities were planned. This reduced vulnerability, but it increased complexity. Coordination suffered. Transport demands multiplied. Oversight weakened. Complex systems under pressure tend to fail silently before they fail visibly. Financial strain followed the same pattern. The cost of war accelerated faster than real output. Controls hid inflation, but they could not erase it. Savings lost value in real terms. Black markets expanded. Allocation replaced choice. The economy still functioned, but only through coercion and control. Labor policy hardened. As German workers were drawn deeper into the military, the industrial base hollowed out. Replacement labor came from occupied territories. These workers were less skilled, less motivated, and more difficult to integrate into complex production processes. Output figures did not reflect output quality. Defects increased. Repairs took longer. Waste rose. Each unit produced delivered less effective value than before. The system compensated by demanding more volume, which further strained supply. This created a feedback loop. More pressure produced more output in the short term. But it also increased breakdowns. inefficiencies, and losses. Each success weakened the foundation for the next. By late 1942, this reality could no longer be ignored internally. The war economy was still producing, but it was no longer resilient. Any shock now carried outsized consequences. A transport disruption, a fuel shortfall, or a bombing raid could trigger failures across multiple sectors. Germany had entered the danger zone of total war economics. Not collapse, but fragility. This is the critical escalation. The economy had passed the point where adjustments could restore balance. Every solution required greater control. Every gain depended on deeper sacrifice. The system survived by consuming its own reserves, material, human, and structural. What mattered now was not whether Germany could produce weapons. It could. What mattered was whether it could continue producing them faster than the system was breaking down. And by the end of 1942, that balance was tipping. The economy was still moving forward, but it was doing so on borrowed time. The breaking point had not arrived yet, but it was no longer avoidable. The breaking point did not announce itself with a single collapse. It arrived as a convergence. By early 1943, Germany's war economy was still producing impressive numbers on paper. Weapons output reached new highs in several categories. Official reports spoke of recovery and momentum. But beneath those figures, the structure was failing. What collapsed first was balance. The economy could no longer absorb shocks. Each disruption, fuel shortages, transport failures, bombing damage now triggered wider breakdowns. Systems that once recovered in days now took weeks. Some never fully recovered at all. Strategic bombing intensified this fragility. It was not the destruction of individual factories that proved decisive. It was the cumulative disruption. Power grids failed repeatedly. Rail junctions were damaged faster than they could be repaired. Workers spent more time moving between sites than producing. Output targets became aspirational rather than operational. Germany's dispersion strategy now revealed its cost. Production scattered across dozens of locations required coordination that the transport network could not reliably provide. Components arrived late or not at all. Assembly lines waited. Finished weapons piled up in the wrong places, unusable where they were most needed. This was systemic failure, not dramatic, but relentless. Fuel became the decisive constraint. Synthetic production never met demand. Deliveries fluctuated. Priorities shifted constantly between the military, transport, and industry. Entire sectors were shut down temporarily to preserve fuel for critical operations. An economy cannot function when energy allocation becomes triage. Labor shortages reached their peak. The skilled workforce had been hollowed out. Forced labor filled numbers but not capability. Complex machinery required experience. Errors multiplied. Output quality declined further. Maintenance backlogs grew uncontrollably. The system compensated by demanding even more output. This was the fatal mistake. Instead of stabilizing production at sustainable levels, targets were raised again. Overtime became permanent. Safety margins disappeared. Equipment failures increased. Every breakdown now cascaded through already strained networks. The economy entered a state of self-cannibalization. It produced by destroying its own capacity to produce. Financial strain followed the same pattern. Controls prevented visible inflation, but shortages spread. Rationing tightened. Civilian morale eroded. Black markets expanded. Allocation replaced planning. Authority replaced efficiency. These were not signs of control. They were symptoms of exhaustion. By mid-1943, the illusion of recovery collapsed internally. Officials no longer asked whether targets could be met. They asked which sectors could be sacrificed, which regions could be deprived, which operations could be delayed. This is the language of decline. The war economy had reached its breaking logic. It could no longer grow without shrinking somewhere else. Every gain required a loss. Every priority created multiple vulnerabilities. who benefited from this system was clear in the short term. The military received weapons, often late, often imperfect, but still arriving. Leadership could claim continued resistance. The war continued. Who paid the price was broader. Workers endured exhaustion. Civilians endured scarcity. Infrastructure endured relentless strain. The future was consumed to sustain the present. This is the critical collapse phase, not of output, but of sustainability. Germany could still fight, but it could no longer recover. From this point forward, the war economy operated without margin. Any additional pressure expanded. Bombing, territorial losses, deeper fuel shortages would not slow production gradually. It would cause failure. The economy had become a brittle machine, strong when intact, catastrophic when stressed. This is why the later collapse appears sudden in hindsight. It was not sudden, it was delayed. By 1943, Germany's war economy was no longer capable of adaptation. It could only continue on its existing path until something broke decisively. And when that moment arrived, there would be no reserve left to draw upon. The collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a condition waiting for a trigger. The final collapse of Germany's war economy did not come as a surprise to those inside the system. It came as an inevitability finally made visible. By late 1943 and into 1944, the economy was no longer balancing competing demands. It was choosing which failures to accept. Fuel shortages worsened. Transport networks operated in fragments. Power supply became unreliable across entire regions. Production figures still existed, but they no longer represented real capacity. What remained was momentum without resilience. Strategic bombing now struck an economy that could not recover. Rail hubs were damaged faster than repair crews could respond. Synthetic fuel plants, already operating at the edge of feasibility, became critical vulnerabilities. Each disruption forced emergency reallocations that weakened other sectors. The system responded the only way it could, by narrowing priorities. Civilian consumption was cut to the minimum. Non-essential industries were abandoned. Infrastructure maintenance was postponed indefinitely. The economy no longer planned for the future. It reacted to the present. This is the defining characteristic of collapse. Not when production stops, but when recovery becomes impossible. By 1944, Germany's war economy depended on constant motion. Trains had to run. Power had to flow. Fuel had to arrive on time. There was no slack, no buffer, no reserve. Any interruption now produced immediate consequences at the front. Weapons arrived late. Vehicles lacked fuel. Repairs took longer than losses. The connection between economic strain and military failure became direct. This is where the outcome was sealed. The economy could no longer support strategic choice. Military decisions were dictated by fuel availability, transport capacity, and production breakdowns. Flexibility vanished. At the same time, the human cost peaked. Workers were exhausted. Labor systems were coercive and inefficient. Skilled capacity was irreversibly degraded. The economy had consumed its own foundation. What remained was output without sustainability. Germany's war economy had reached the end state of total war miscalculation. It had been built for speed, not endurance. For expansion, not equilibrium. When forced into prolonged conflict against superior industrial power, its weaknesses became fatal. This is the lesson history often misses. The collapse did not begin with defeat. Defeat followed collapse. By the time territories were lost and armies retreated, the economic outcome had already been decided. The system could no longer replace what it lost. It could no longer repair what was damaged. It could no longer adapt to changing conditions. The final months revealed what had been true since 1942. Germany was fighting on borrowed capacity. When that capacity was exhausted, the war economy did not slow. It failed. The long-term impact of this collapse reshaped how modern war is understood. It demonstrated that industrial strength is not just about output, but about resilience. That total mobilization without balance destroys itself. That systems built on pressure eventually break. Germany's war economy collapsed not because it lacked ambition. It collapsed because it ignored limits. And those limits appeared years before the end, hidden beneath numbers, masked by control and delayed by force. By the time the collapse became visible to the world, it was already irreversible. The war economy had not lost the ability to produce weapons. It had lost the ability to sustain itself. That is how wars are truly lost.